Everyday Inclusion and Belonging, where we talk about literally everything under the sun when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I was introduced, Kevin and I were introduced maybe about a month, 2 months ago.
Mhm.
It was right when his phenomenal book is coming out, and you will see me plug this probably 12 different times in the conversation Kevin and I are about to have, because my background is org dev and a lot of change management. And I see everything that we're doing around creating inclusive cultures as one big transformational daily culture change. And so, Kevin, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and then we're going to dig in, because I gave him a preview of like the 1,000 questions I want to ask him today, and we'll get through it all. So, Kevin, the amazing work that you and the I4CP team are doing, tell us all about it.
Thanks, Mo. Appreciate it. Well, yeah, it's great to be here today. As you said, I'm thrilled with the reception of the book that just came out a couple months ago. But I'll give you a little bit of background. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of I4CP, which stands for the Institute for Corporate Productivity, and we're doing more HR research than just about anybody on the planet, always with a business lens of what are high performance organizations doing differently with their people practices versus low performance organizations. And so we have a team of analysts that goes out and researches a variety of different HR topics. And while we come up with a lot of best practices, what we really hang our hat on are next practices. And we define those as practices where we see a very strong correlation to market performance or bottom line business impact, yet not a lot of companies have yet implemented that practice. And a couple of years ago, we did one of the biggest research studies I've seen on culture and how to change culture, and that's really the basis of the book, which is now in its third printing. It's been the number one new release on Amazon in a dozen different categories, is in the bestseller list of several other categories today, and I've been really excited by the reception that it's had.
Well, and I love it because it really is truly a blueprint, and then the stories that you weave in terms of, here's what's actually happened in some of these next practice companies.
Right.
So let's talk about this idea of, just first and foremost, that healthy cultures embrace change. And I know that you say, and sometimes they actually instigate change.
Right.
And that has certainly, if you look at the past 16 months, really served companies well, hasn't it?
Yeah, if there's anything that's brought out the necessity to be agile and embrace change, it's the pandemic. And our research has shown this for years. We did a research study a few years ago called the 3 A's of organizational agility. And in that study, it was very clear that companies where employees say they hate change or they hope things don't change, they typically are in low performing organizations. And companies where the employee base will say they not only feel change is normal, but they almost enjoy it and they take advantage of change, those are high performing organizations. And I think most CEOs would like to have a workforce that embraces agility with passion and like you said, even intentionally shakes things up. I've seen several companies who do that on a regular basis by moving people on a regular basis, reorging on a regular basis. They're just constantly in motion. And I think those tend to be healthier companies, frankly, even though there are some people out there that don't want that. They don't want the change. That change keeps you agile and also is more well-rounded for the whole organization. There's so many benefits to the individual from talent mobility, and I talk about that at the end of the book, but also to the organization itself, just from a communication collaboration standpoint. Making sure that the organization is never at a standstill, I think, is always a good thing.
Well, and we really talk about inclusion being woven into daily culture, and this idea that you're never ever done, and it's always changing when it comes to what you're doing, those everyday inclusive behaviors. And so this whole growth mindset,
Yeah.
uh, and having a growth mindset is absolutely about embracing change. Oh, I learned something new, I hit this, I'm learning something, like how to do this better, how to. And so when we're talking about inclusive behaviors, those are what make up inclusive cultures, right? That every day. So I want to dig in on the blueprint. So let's talk about the first step, which you talk about, um, developing and deploying a comprehensive listening strategy.
Yeah, and before we get into that, let me give a little bit of baseline here for how the book came about. Most people will use the term culture transformation when they talk about culture change. If you Google that, you'll get over 1 million hits. And we were using that term originally as well when we did the research study. But as we got into it, I realized that many of the companies that were very successful at culture change, they weren't transforming their culture. They weren't starting from scratch and making it something completely different. Instead, they were renovating their culture and keeping what made them great originally going forward. So that's where the name came about. But the basis of the research study was trying to figure out, is there a commonality in the companies that succeed that we could draw out and help other companies who are trying to change their culture with more of that blueprint. Our research, and frankly, every other study I've ever read on this says the same thing. Only 15% of companies that try to change their cultures actually succeed.
Yeah.
So we honed in on that 15% and from it created the blueprint and the 18 action steps that make up the book that companies can follow in order to successfully change culture. And the very first one is develop and deploy a comprehensive listening strategy. And I say this to executive teams all the time. In fact, I just said it yesterday to an executive team. The worst thing you can do is lock yourselves in a conference room as the senior leadership and decide amongst yourselves what the culture is inside the company, because you'll get it wrong. Things get filtered by the time they get up to the CEO and senior team, and the issues that affect the culture generally aren't that visible to the senior team. And so the comprehensive listening strategy is designed to get as low as you can in the organization, have frequent surveys and frequent listening strategies so that you can really uncover what the issues are, not just the issue du jour, but the longer lasting issues. So that you have a good understanding of what are the issues you've got to correct, but also what do people really cherish and what do you want to keep? And that's all part of that listening strategy, Mo.
Well, and I think there's something there too, going back to this, when you're using the blueprint, I think about when you've got the bones of a good house, right? And you're
Right.
going to do your renovation, you keep what's working in the structure, you keep what's working in the layout, and then you add, right, and change around that. And I think what I saw, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, about a listening, I saw more listening happening after George Floyd's murder, where um, there was both a vulnerability and a listening that was happening that I hadn't seen before
Yeah.
around, and I'm talking in particular around issues around race and equity, but also, seeing this now, right, with the rise in AAPI hate, and that's not, that's been happening since last year. It's just getting the press and
The
the media.
visibility, right?
So those companies that were already going in and listening, right, and making this consistent and constant versus the one time a year employee engagement survey.
Yeah.
um so, and in particular, when you're thinking about inclusion and belonging, those are different questions than are you engaged.
Yeah, you're right.
I often use myself as an example in this. I was highly engaged at a company. I mean, if you'd taken me through the Gallup 12, I would have answered every single one. You would have thought I never would have left that company. But then I became a mom and I started hitting maternal bias, and I
Hmm.
didn't feel like I belonged anymore, and I quit.
Yep.
Right. So I think there's also, what are you listening for?
Yeah.
That's really important.
Well,
Um,
you're so right. And boy, there's so many things we can unpack in what you just said. Obviously, the pandemic itself has created more of a need to listen, but I think we always can look back on inflection points. And George Floyd's murder obviously was a huge one, where companies began to really exhibit the empathy that they had started at the beginning of the pandemic, and began really listening through a variety of methods to the workforce. I can't tell you how many companies I've talked to where the CEO was sitting in on various conversations, and I think that's where sometimes you get the richest learnings, is having peer-to-peer conversations around tough issues like that inside the organization. But they were really taking the time to understand what it was like for for Black employees in their organization, or any underrepresented class in the organization, and hearing their stories directly, I think, was very, very powerful. And then when when we talk about inclusion from a mom perspective, this pandemic has been very, very tough, obviously, on working mothers. They've been the hardest hit. There's even some evidence that working mothers from an underrepresented class has been even harder hit, and so I think it's going to take some time before we recover from that. Frankly, going forward, it's sad. I don't think any of us would have necessarily predicted that would be the case at the beginning of the pandemic, but all the evidence is clear
Yeah,
that
yeah, we've
it's
gone
been an
backwards.
issue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gone backwards. It's been actually devastating. And I think, so how do you navigate your way out of that, understanding that impact, and how do you get some of those women back,
Right.
particularly women of color? So yeah, there's so much. Like we could just stay on this first one, but I won't.
Well, let me. So a couple things on the listening strategy. I'm excited by technology and how that's helping in listening today. More and more companies are beginning to use natural language processing to allow employees to share their sentiment in their own voice. And so what NLP does, it's coupled usually with some artificial intelligence, but it analyzes text, across hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees, and provides companies with categorization of that sentiment, so that the laborious task of reading through every comment and then trying to correctly categorize it kind of goes away. And so more and more companies are beginning to use that inside their company, but they're also using it externally as well. For any large company, there's a lot being said out on Glassdoor or Comparably, or Fairy Godboss. You name the site. And while some of that can be a little bit more caustic than what's said internally, because you get some ex-employee sentiment out there, there's usually a sliver of truth, particularly the more comments that you have. And it's important for companies to know what's being said, because that's what candidates are reading. Candidates are going out to Glassdoor and reading about the company before they decide to join that organization. So I think coupling what's being said externally with what you're gathering internally gives you a very comprehensive picture of the cultural issues, both good and bad, that you need to tackle.
Well, and I think, Glassdoor announced, and I haven't gone out, Kevin, I don't know if you have, that they're going to allow people to share their demographic data too, right? So
That's
you're
smart.
going to see, hey, if I'm a Black woman, here's what it feels like to work at that company. So that external listening strategy is really important.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad
Yeah.
it's happening.
I mean, we say there's nowhere to hide, right? There's nowhere to hide anymore. So
Right, right.
whether you have to renovate your house or get your house in order, right? You better be paying attention to this stuff. So then there's this idea. Number 4 is around defining desired behaviors. And I like this idea of companies really then switching from thinking about, here were the results, to know what were the behaviors that actually got those results.
Yeah.
And rewarding people for the behaviors that got the results, versus we've all worked with the people that, like, they leave dead bodies behind, right? They achieve all the things,
Yeah.
but leave this awful wake. So I think so say a little bit about that, and then I do want to talk about culture fit versus culture add.
Yeah, sure. So, Bob Sutton wrote a great book many years ago called The No Asshole Rule. And it's really around that whole concept of, people who internally are just hurricanes, but they get results. And a lot of companies tolerate those people because of the results, but they're so detrimental to the culture itself, particularly the higher up those people are in the organization. And, leading a company, I'm sure you've had this experience many times. I joke that for some people the sun always shines up, because to me, they're always the epitome of a great employee, but to others they were that absolute wreck. And so it's important, I think, to understand that, where you have that inside the organization, But for your leaders, when you're making a culture change, you want to make sure they understand the behaviors that you expect and that are expected and that are aligned with whatever your purpose is and your values of your organization. Employees are going to do what the leaders do. It doesn't, whatever's written in the PowerPoint or on the wall, it doesn't matter as much as what the leaders actually do. And so I highlight in the book several companies who spent a lot of time and budget and energy on training their leaders on the desired behaviors. And it was very clear in the data that the companies that were successful at changing their culture, they focused on that probably 7 times as much as the companies that were unsuccessful at changing their culture. And there was one company I highlighted in that chapter that I love talking about, and that's F5 Networks. And I think what Francois, the CEO, who I interviewed for the book, and Anna White, his CHRO, have done and continue to do around their culture change really started with making sure that they had the behaviors of leaders inside the company at all levels, not just senior levels, but mid-level managers, frontline leaders. They put a lot of energy into making sure that they understood the behaviors that were expected.
Well, and I think oftentimes what we'll see is it may stop at the C-suite. And when you think about your frontline leaders, your frontline managers, they touch 80% of your employees. So you really do have to push that down.
Right.
So culture fit versus culture add when we're talking about desired behaviors.
Yeah, it's funny. Brene Brown and I was on her podcast a couple months ago. We got into that conversation. Um, for some reason, culture fit has become a really bad word in HR circles. And I think a little bit unnecessarily, to tell you the truth. I think we all know why. It's culture fit can be synonymous with homogenous, right? And you're just bringing in people that are like you and like everybody else. I think companies are smart enough to know the difference between that and whether somebody's going to work inside the culture or not. And so that's where the term culture add has come in, because now you're bringing in skill sets and experiences and viewpoints and just different people to add to your culture versus just fit right in. To me, it's a little bit of a nuance. It's an important nuance for companies if they are too homogenous. But it's Brene was surprised that culture fit had become a bad word. She's like, really? I thought that was a great term
Well,
when I talked to her about it.
What's interesting about that is because they've also very specifically designed behaviors and values around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Correct. Right. And that's what she said. Yes.
Also, you're fitting into something. And I think that's what I see, particularly with smaller organizations, is when you have people that are a part of that interview process that are untrained, and they're seeing culture, they're conflating their like me unconscious bias with culture fit.
Yeah.
Versus, right, they haven't done that defined, and then know that you fit because you're actually inclusive, right? Your behavior.
Right.
Okay, so number 5, identifying influencers, energizers, and blockers. And I'm about to say something that I think is going to be pretty controversial.
do you want, before you do that, do you want me to explain what I meant by that chapter? So this to me is one of the more important steps in the whole process. While almost all successful culture changes in companies have the support of the CEO and senior team, and typically are leader led from that perspective, you absolutely have to have the cooperation and a co-creation mentality of the workforce. And that's the recipe for success. But in order to make sure that you get this, your culture change effort spread throughout the workforce, it's important to understand who are going to be the culture ambassadors inside your organization. And in every company, there are people who are go-to people. They're the influencers, they're the subject matter experts, opinion leaders, everybody, you all know those people inside your organization. And frankly, senior leadership rarely does. They don't know those people if they're especially if they're further down the hierarchy. Sometimes they're introverts and not extroverts, so they're not that easy to spot. And so we're big proponents of organizational network analysis, which is a science that shows where is workflow happening and collaboration happening. and it will show you and illuminate, those people that are so critical to your organization, as well as the people on the outskirts that aren't collaborating and, people aren't going to. Those people that are sort of in the center of the beehive, those are your influencers, and oftentimes they're the energizers as well. And through surveys, you can ask that question. You've had this experience many times where you talk to somebody and you walk away just fired up. You're excited, and then
Go.
others you talk to and they suck the life out of you, right? So those influencers and energizers are the people you want to be your culture ambassadors. You want to bring them in early on your culture change efforts, and they will help spread the word. And equally, you want to understand who are the blockers inside the company. So
Yeah.
now we'll get to your controversial question.
Well, and I think what's most most times in my experience, Kevin, what I've seen is those influence and energize like that they aren't on an org chart per se, right? They kind of
Right.
hidden away in different parts of the organization. I talk quite a bit, if you look at Jack Welch's executive assistant,
Hmm.
a great example of that, right? The level of influence that she had in that organization, people would go to her. Nobody could get to Jack unless they got through her, so on multiple levels, both structurally, but also, and you're hard pressed to even find a picture of her, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Um,
EAs are often these people inside of
yeah, yeah.
organizations. Yeah.
So here's what I have seen in the last year, and I think it's very well intentioned, and I think it's going to backfire. So I've seen the rise of the DEI committee,
Mm.
right, where it's people who are not necessarily influencers and energizers. Um, a lot of white people, guilty. I want to be on, right? I have this feeling of guilt. I want to do
Hmm.
something, right? Which is a horrible reason, right? Or we have people from underrepresented groups who are already overburdened with having to, right? So then this committee is formed, and then suddenly they're setting DEI strategy for an organization where
Mm.
there is not they don't have the expertise. They
Yeah.
don't have like the motivations for why they're choosing to do things. That would be like saying we have a whole bunch of people that are enthusiastic about product development, so we're going to put them on a committee, and whatever their ideas are for what our next product should be, we're going to do that. Like it makes no sense.
Yeah.
And I think there are some people that are put on those committees that in fact the energizers and the influencers, that it's actually doing a disservice to the work because they're not that, and the energizers and influencers are looking and saying, interesting.
So we do more research in DE&I than just about any topic, and we run a board of chief diversity officers that has 36, very influential diversity executives in large organizations. We've got another group of DE&I professionals, and so I feel very fortunate that we get to work with just so many great minds around this subject. And one of the core tenets of research that we've done is it's very clear that companies who are putting effort into diversity and inclusion only because of pressure, outside pressure from investors or the public, or just to look good, it's very clear that those efforts always fail, and the research will show that. It's the companies that have DE&I in their values, and that it's core to, it's really core to who they are as an organization. Those are the companies that are just marvelous at it. Now, I'm a big proponent of measurement. I think if you're trying to make progress in DE&I, you've got to have some goals. You've got to measure those goals on a regular basis. I've seen some very effective uses of predictive analytics as part of this process too, because I think there are some companies who naively think they can just hire their way to, have a more diverse workforce, and it doesn't necessarily work that way. Um, in fact, we've seen a lot of companies where if you don't put enough effort into the inclusion aspect of it, you'll get diverse populations that opt out after a year or two because it just they never were included in the organization.
Yeah, and that is, I actually I want to see your data in a year to 18 months, because, and this community has heard me say this, I think there is a huge failure of leadership happening right now with a lot of companies that are scrambling to hire for diversity and then putting people in toxic work environments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there guaranteed is going to be a spike in turnover. I also think there's probably going to be a spike in some lawsuits. And I say it's a failure of leadership because putting people in an environment where they are set up to lose, and you haven't given the thought to what is this, what is our culture, right? and
Right.
and do we even have the bones, uh, or are we being performative here? And I so measurement is near and dear to me as well. I mean, that's we built into the Everyday Inclusion app specific measurement of feelings of inclusion and belonging, right?
Hmm.
So that it can be predictive to what's happening, right? And pulse survey and ongoing. And I think what'll be interesting too is to map some of that against what's happening out in the world.
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you the group that has unfairly been, had this all put on their shoulders is talent acquisition.
Yeah,
I think when you
God,
look
there's
in
so many
any
people.
organization that says that, they're trying to be more diverse, a lot of that just flows right down to the TA group. And, it's interesting. We have a whole group of TA professionals, a TA board as well. And that's number one on their list is DE and I. But it can't be all on their shoulders. We often put employer brand on their shoulders, all kinds of things about the organization. And, I think that from an inclusion perspective, there's so many other areas that have to get involved to make this successful over time.
Well, and right, diversity and equity are really happening at the systems, at the leadership level.
Hmm.
Inclusion and belonging, everybody in the organization all day long. And so it can't live in one place. And you certainly can't just measure sort of those vanity metrics of are we changing our diversity? Measuring that inclusion piece is so, and then doing something about it, right? So
Yeah.
gosh, don't ask me a question and then not don't measure
Right.
something and not take action, which I think leads then to number 12, which is provide training on desired behaviors and actually having leaders as teachers.
Yeah, I love leaders as teachers as a methodology. That was something that GE put in a long time ago and made popular. Still today, too few companies put enough effort into this and make it formal. I think there's a lot of benefits to the company when you have leaders teaching topics, but you have to have a formal program. You can't just bring in leaders and expect them to know how to teach. You've got to help them teach and teach them how to teach. They're typically very good at storytelling, but a lot of times when they get brought into a class situation, they'll take it in a different direction, right, than what you're trying to do. But when you have a formal leaders as teachers program, there's a lot of benefits to the leaders as well. They get much more in tune with some of the issues inside the organization and exposed to great talent that they might not have been exposed to before. And they develop as individuals. You never learn a topic better than when you have to teach it.
Yeah.
So I love, leaders as teachers as a methodology.
Well, and so this is where I'll wonk out a little bit on, right, when you look at some of the neuroscience around behavior change, and when you look at some of the neuroscience around inclusion,
Hmm.
um, the one and done training is never going to work for you, right? It's
Right.
not going to be sticky. It's not going to be. You and I both are huge fans of how Starbucks responded, right? Because what they did is they knew that that training, right, shutting down all their stores for a day, that wasn't going to change behavior ongoing, but it sure
Right.
did make a statement
Yep.
and put a stake in the ground about this is important. We're willing to do this, and then ongoing. And that for us, with everyday inclusion, we've got our 52-week playbook for managers, right, where they can literally 5 minutes at a time keep this conversation going. So I think when we're thinking about inclusion, belonging, so what are you doing to equip particularly those frontline leaders to be in constant conversation with their teams about inclusion and belonging tactics? Because it's not a company that excludes, it's people. And
Right.
so we have to keep teaching our people, and I love and putting it in the hands of those team leaders.
And Starbucks does such a great job at that. It almost seems tame now, but that, Rittenhouse Square incident, right? that happened back in 2018 was what sparked that. And I was just amazed at how quickly they responded. Within
Good.
5 days, they had announced that they were closing the stores and having the training that they had. But that served them well. So when George Floyd died, and then for other incidents afterwards, they repeated the process
Yep.
essentially that they had started back then, which was really just centered around those great conversations, those peer-to-peer conversations inside the stores and with their coworkers. I love what they did, and I always shuddered at any criticism that they received for their actions, because they always viewed that as just one step of a longer process.
In what had already been, when you talk about cultural renovation, in what had already been a commitment.
Yeah.
So I think there's, and so I would urge. So I'm going to go through some of the things that we just talked about. So make sure you've got that comprehensive listening strategy, and how are you ongoing getting that feedback through pulse survey. Define the desired behaviors, and then switch from thinking about results to actually how people got to those results. Lots of great conversation about culture fit, culture add there. Identify the influencers, energizers, and blockers.
Hmm.
So again, and I'm putting the inclusion lens on this, who are those people and how do you get them engaged in really walking this talk all day? And getting people to, whether it's, when you're talking about this, are they running a meeting in a way that's inclusive, right? Those
Right.
everyday, determine how progress will be measured. And think about those predictive measures versus, we talk about windshield versus rear view mirror.
Right.
And then provide training on the desired behaviors and leaders as teachers. We could keep going, Kevin, but we
Yeah.
are at time. I would love for you to leave me with one last truth bomb. We'll make sure that we put the link, both to I4CP, and to the book in the show. The transcript for this will be out in about a week or two, on our site. I'm giving you some time to think about one last truth bomb.
No, yeah, that's fine. So there's a separate website for the book at
That's right.
culturerenovation.com. Yeah. And there's a lot of great info out there. I think the way I end the book is the truth bomb. You never plant a flag in the ground in declaration that we've done it. We have changed culture, right? It's an ongoing process. I talk about Microsoft a lot early in the book, and I talk about them just a lot in general, because I think what Satya Nadella and Kathleen Hogan and the team there have done has just been remarkable. But they get a little nervous when I talk about them so glowingly, because they they know there's so many more things they want to do to their culture, and they never stop. So I think that's the truth bomb, is that this is an ongoing effort, and that's what the website is designed to do, just to keep this conversation ongoing.
Well, and that's it, right? We're all on the journey. We got to stay on the journey.
Right.
Wouldn't it be great though if we could just be like, "Whoa, done, huh?" Super.
Right. Sit back and
Thank you so much for joining me. This was great. Check out Kevin's book. We're excited. We're actually collaborating with I4CP, and we're putting some of their research actually in the app, because those sort of next practices are so key when they come to, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Thank you all. We will see you next week. And wherever you are, I hope it's a lovely spring day. I feel like we're at the light at the end of so many tunnels right now.
Mhm.
It's feeling pretty hopeful. So thanks all. Get out there and do the